I have been playing Dungeons & Dragons for this many editions, and throughout that time, I've mostly been playing it wrong. But there's no wrong way to play Dungeons & Dragons, and during that time, the most fun I've ever had just being immersed in a story and role-playing with friends, and not even picking up the dice, has been at a D&D session. But D&D isn't a good system for role-playing. Okay, don't go down in the comments yet and tell me how wrong I am and how I'm gatekeeping. Just hold on. We're going to work through this. This is a very nuanced subject today. This is culture of play versus rules as written. So let's put on our design hats, roll up our sleeves, and really dig into this fascinating subject that we as tabletop designers or homebrewers should consider. And to start off this journey, we need to travel back many years to my awkward time as a teenager. If you're new around here, hi, I'm Peter, creator and lead designer of Tales from Elsewhere. It's a series of action horror tabletop role-playing games, and there's info about that game down below. We're running playtests right now. We've got a Discord. So come check it out, maybe like and subscribe to this channel. It's good stuff. That out of the way, let's dig into the subject at hand, my awkward teenage years. It's the year 2000, I'm a freshman in high school, and I go on a visit to some family in the North Woods of Wisconsin. And it is a beautiful time. It's this cabin out in the woods, but outside of the cabin, it is swelteringly humid and there are millions of mosquitoes that beset us. Inside the cabin, there is no video games, no internet, no TV, and I didn't bring my Magic the Gathering cards. Fortunately, my cousin had brought his brand new, just released, 3rd edition Player's Handbook for Dungeons & Dragons. Now, I'd been connected to nerd culture in general before this. I played Magic cards, video games, the whole deal, but I'd never played Dungeons & Dragons. So my cousin teaches us how to play. Now, I don't really read the book. He just shows us how to play there at the dining room table. And he teaches us based on how he understood Dungeons & Dragons from when his father taught him how to play earlier editions. So he came from an existing legacy of tabletop experience. So he teaches me, I then go back home afterward, and I buy the books and I teach my friends how to play, based largely on my experiences with him. Now, I start poring over these rule books and I realize the way my cousin taught me how to play doesn't exactly line up with the way things are presented in the 3 core rule books, Player's Handbook, Monster Manual, and Dungeon Master's Guide, and that I had been running things inaccurately for my friends, I guess you could say. I was running them wrong. Or was I? You see, I had been filtering all the rules I was reading and the gameplay through a legacy of culture. From an uncle who taught my cousin, who then taught me, I had now taught my friends, and their perceptions were even more removed from the rules as written themselves. And that's because they weren't reading the Player's Handbook in great detail. They'd maybe flip to their class section. They were relying on me, the Dungeon Master, to facilitate that gameplay experience. This is culture of play. So now I'd like to define the other half of this equation briefly, rules as written, or RAW, as some people like to say. So the rules as written is pretty self-explanatory. It's the rules as they exist on the page. It is the law of the letter and the letter of the law, whether it's 3rd edition or 5.5. So when people say they're playing raw or based on the rules as written, they mean not relying on DM adjudication to figure out how to run a scene, but finding the specific rules reference, the text in the book that tells them how to resolve things. Now, the quick third definition we need to mention is the rules as intended, which is the motivation and intention behind the rules as written. It's what the designers intended you to understand when you read the rules. So that's also fairly self-explanatory. We've got that in our pocket now. So going back to the year 2000, we were not playing the game, either in the woods of Wisconsin or back home, rules as written, or maybe even rules as intended. We were playing it based on a culture of play. That means we were not playing by the rules as they're presented in the book. Does that mean we're playing it wrong? Well, no, of course not. There's not a wrong way to play a tabletop game. The goal is to have fun. But we were ignoring, omitting, and forgetting many rules as they existed on the page itself. Okay, I hope you're still with me on this. We've got these 3 definitions now: culture of play, rules as written, rules as intended. So why do these definitions matter, and why have I added in the culture of play to the normal discussion of rules as written and rules as intended? There are 2 main reasons. One is the subject of gatekeeping within the community, which I'll only touch on lightly. But more relevant to this channel and to what we work on here together, it's how it's related to judging and analyzing tabletop role-playing game systems. Now, I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons continuously across these editions for about 25 years now, and I'll bet you most of you out there watching never actually play rules as written. Mainly because it's not necessarily fun. I just had a D&D session where we were really struggling to get used to the transition between 5th edition and 5.5, and we legit spent like 10 or 15 minutes double checking how to interact with a hooded lantern because we were trying to really understand the rules changes between these two small editions. And there's a bunch of contradictory stuff in the rulebook. It's how these object interactions are categorized versus the explicit rules on the hooded lantern, but it doesn't actually mention putting the shutter down on the hooded lantern, just bringing it up. Is it a bonus action, an action? Anyway, playing rules as written can be tiresome, but I frequently do actually try to play exactly as the rules are presented because it's interesting. However, I don't think there's any right way to approach that. I think gatekeeping which rules you ignore and which ones you keep out of any edition of any role-playing game is a non-starter. However you want to take these guidances that these books provide and run your game, more power to you. I don't care how many rules you ignore or keep, as long as you're having fun and telling a good story. Play whatever games you want. That's enough on that. That's kind of a well-trodden ground and not really the subject of this channel, but I just wanted to mention it very briefly. So now onto the heart of the matter and why I made this video in the first place. I frequent lots of Discord servers, YouTube channels, subreddits, and I see a lot of people judging game systems and reviewing them and analyzing them based on the culture of play surrounding that game, not necessarily the rules as written. So, for example, I see a lot of people say that Dungeons & Dragons is a great game to tell epic stories in, to have tons of role play, but they're judging that based on the culture of play surrounding the game. You know, if you watch something like Critical Role, Dimension 20, Legends of Evantris, any of these awesome creators, they tell these wonderful stories full of rich role play, and they often don't even pick up the dice a whole lot. But that's the culture of play that they are presenting, not the game system itself. And I agree with them. If we look at this based on culture of play, yeah, D&D is great. I've had amazing stories based on role play, very little dice involved, playing Dungeons & Dragons over decades. I've had so much fun, such rich narrative experiences. But is that because of the rules as written, or because the culture that was instilled in me? Because, let's be real, if we look at the page count dedicated to social interactions and roleplay mechanics in D&D 5.5, it's like 2.5 pages maybe of this content that is actually dedicated to providing structure to that as far as gameplay systems go. Most of D&D's books are devoted to violent resolution, combat, and combat-related abilities. So, the rules as written aren't actually providing a great scaffolding or framework for narrative-rich experiences, especially when you compare them to games that have made that more of an emphasis. You have extremely narrative-based games or purely narrative-based games like The Good Society, or ones that have created a homogeneous experience in a good way between all of the pillars, like Blades in the Dark. Those ones are providing you framework, rules as written, for narrative and roleplay heavy scenarios. I firmly believe that we, the community, and especially tabletop designers, need to examine games based on the rules as written and try to divorce ourselves a bit from the culture of play that may surround it. Now, this is mostly just relevant to the titans in the industry like Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder, and you'll find different cultures of play in each of those communities. But when we are designing a game like Tales from Elsewhere, I don't have the luxury of, 50 years of culture of play behind the game I'm making. So I can't rely on that to articulate a methodology of roleplay or a methodology of gameplay to an audience. The rules as written have to stand on their own merits. You'll often see a culture of play work against the acceptance of a new product. For example, I tune into the MCDM Q&A streams when they run them. And Matt and his team were talking about how some of the structures in Draw Steel can turn people off if they're coming from D&D, because they're a divergence from the culture of play that D&D has. Even if, the rules on the page aren't any more complex necessarily or strange, but it's because it runs counter to how the zeitgeist has interpreted tabletop role-playing games. So even someone as talented and ubiquitous as Matt Colville and his team, they run into this problem as well, because culture of play is how primarily a lot of people approach tabletop role-playing games. And to triple underline it, there's nothing wrong with that. You play games however you want to with your local culture, totally fine. But again, the designers have to take a little bit of a different approach and keep that in mind as we're building. To wrap up all of those concepts into one little line, I would say people tend to judge their favorite game based on the culture of play, and judge other games based on the rules as written. And we have to be cautious of those biases. So I know that was a long-winded rant, and I hope that you, the viewer, understand where I'm coming from on this. I'm not actually attempting to tell people how to play a game or how to enjoy their game. It's actually the opposite. It's helping us parse the language and biases around how we review and discuss the systems of tabletop role-playing games. So again, you shouldn't be telling people that they're playing the right or the wrong way, but we can talk about what gameplay habits or cultural play practices are in alignment with the rules as written. That's a perfectly acceptable conversation, because like I said, most of the time, I don't play D&D correctly. I make tons of changes based on how I prefer to run games and the culture I want to facilitate and the cultural legacy that I come from. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when I enter designer mode, I have to be very careful about those biases and make sure that I'm not judging Pathfinder 2nd Edition based on its rules as written, but allowing myself the grace for Dungeons & Dragons because of the culture of play I come from. So I hope that all makes sense. I hope you get where I'm coming from on this, and I really do appreciate if you've made it this far in the video. I know this one probably a longer one, but I find this subject infinitely fascinating. And if you want to keep talking about this subject, definitely comment down below. I'm super active down there, or join the Tales from Elsewhere Discord. I'm also on there all the time, chatting away with people about their games, about Tales from Elsewhere. So come hang out, and we'll continue this conversation. All right, folks, thank you so much for watching. I will catch you next time on Tales from Elsewhere.